Hi there, this is Tim.
This is Morgan LaPlante, a first-year painting student.
I'm Keaton Clark, also a first-year painting student.
And for this video, we're looking at an extended figure painting, and I decided to go a little bit of a different direction here with this. Instead of just doing a really formal build-up or even an impressionistic painting, it's sort of a conglomeration of both. And the idea is to describe to the viewer the actual process, at least that I go through, for doing a full figure painting, and in this case, a figure with some drapery. For the Academy video, the intent is that for this project, you're doing not just the figure, but some surrounding elements to put it in context, be it sort of the abstract, sort of ethereal context that I'm putting this in, or actually painting the furniture or the wall or whatnot. So here I'm designing a painting. I actually have an idea in mind. Dakota's our model. You may recognize her from some of the previous videos. But I have had this idea of getting her in this sort of turquoise dress, having this dress swoop down. She's actually holding up a bit of it. The dress creates sort of an arc and swoops back into her with maybe some flowers behind. And so I have the basic idea figured out, enough that I've been able to assemble some of the fabrics together, but I don't really have sort of the clear idea of what the painting will look like. And that's where this stage comes in. This is the color sketch. I have selected a canvas size which is a smaller yet proportionally accurate ratio to what I am intending the final painting to be, which is a 2:1 ratio. And so I'm trying to get the placement on here using a little bit of the harmonic proportions, thirds, quarters, halves, to be very pleasing, and also to capture the gestural and sort of swooping quality of the pose. So we're working very, very quickly here. I'm doing a little bit of drawing for this color sketch, but drawing is not my main concern. It's mostly color and actually, believe it or not, the paint application, the distribution of thick and thin, and the level of abstraction that this painting will take, because that will become very directly a guideline for my finished work. You know, after I've spent hours and hours and hours on a painting, you kind of lose the loose abstract quality that you might have originally intended. And if I don't do something like this, sometimes I don't have a very clear idea of how I want to handle it, because I'm going to begin the painting very slow and very careful, and the idea is that I get rapid and more rapid and sort of attack the painting towards the end. And so this is going to give me that guideline to how to attack it as I get to the end with sort of enthusiasm and a really clear guideline, especially since I plan on going so abstract in the end. And so this is going to be very similar to the color sketch video we've done before. I'm essentially treating it as I would treat any 20-30 minute color sketch, and so hopefully you've had a chance to do quite a few of those so far. I'm reaching into my colors really intuitively now. I haven't limited my palette. I usually don't limit my palette for a color sketch. I try to use an extended open palette. That's usually my recommendation. Really feel free to jump all over and dip into any colors you think you might need. And sometimes push the chroma a lot more than you otherwise would. And then maybe zero in on a tighter, more reserved palette afterwards, based off of the experience here. It's kind of a little bit what happened with our portrait video of Martina. I made the colors a little more naturalistic. They started out a little more broken and more intense. So this is just going to hopefully give me an immediate impression of some intense colors and capture an overall feel, an overall gestural quality, an overall directional motion with the intent that I kind of have envisioned here. You'll notice that the fabric she's holding, which is supposed to serve as the bottom of her dress, is a slightly different color. And that's because the dress that we have that was sort of the right shape and the right color did not go much past her knees. And so I wasn't able to get a fabric that was the exact same color. So I felt that having a blue that was kind of close in at least chroma and value, and at least in the same family, would allow me to just extend that teal color down using sort of a color reference from the top half and the directional flow from the bottom half.
So you've already figured out composition before this?
Yeah, I usually do lots of little sketches. I did a drawing sketch before this. Sometimes I do little tiny watercolor thumbnails just without the model, just to try and figure out kind of what I want. You know, I have a definite S-curve idea here with a circle repetition in the background, which will be the intent with the flowers. I kind of mapped in a little circle behind her when we first started. But yeah, I have that idea, S-curve backed up with a circle. and then her arm providing a strong diagonal. So it's sort of a 3 compositional stem with a sort of hierarchy of overall stem breaking down into more subtle stem, which will produce all of the eye flow. And now I'm just really laying in colors as strongly and as purely as I can to at least key the painting. I don't really care how thick it goes on for the figure and the initial aspects of the dress, but then as I get to the surrounding areas of the dress and the surrounding background, that's where I start to concern myself with the opacity, the transparency, the direction of the marks, the size of the marks, and these are all going to be scaled for the larger painting. I'm really trying to just flick my head back and forth. And so with this sped up video, it looks like I'm just turning my head really, really quickly because I just want a fleeting impression of what's up there. I don't want to get lost in any corrections, drawing corrections. I just want to kind of advance and go as quickly as I can. We're giving her as many breaks as she needs to also. I don't think we're going a full 20 minutes because it is a more demanding pose. And especially for this portion of the painting, this is where I'm capturing all of the gesture and energy of a painting that I'm hoping to carry on to the final painting. And so I need her to be really fresh. And I want to do this right in the beginning before she's fatigued from lots and lots of modeling to make sure that I really capture the, all of the movement that I want. For the most part, I'm using pretty stiff brushes, a lot of bristle brushes. I do get into some combers for the background here so I can get some of the irregularity and a little bit of the transparency and some of that background toning showing through and some of those claw marks and swoopinesses. Lots of these strange little random things that I'm hoping to bring to the final painting. I'll also actually adjust some colors a little bit too to help key the painting. When I do these paintings with, for the most part, a white background in them, I actually usually shift the color of that background a little bit to whatever the color of the dress is to provide a little more color unity. If you look behind her now, it's kind of just a really neutral white that's just kind of a little plain, and it looks like she's standing in front of just a plain white wall. I don't really want that. I want this to all tie together color-wise and thematically wise. And she does have really golden skin, which those rich oranges sort of foil against the blue. So having just this most subtle touch of blue in that background helps to create sort of a blue theme, for the picture. And that's something that I'm deliberately doing in the color stage, because once I get into careful observational painting, it's making those changes is a lot harder. I really try to zero in on what's there, so I want to make sure I have this idea sort of figured out. I feel completely free to make any color changes or modifications that I need to at this stage because I don't have a lot invested in it.
So you said you're choosing the color more intuitively?
Well, just for the background, and it's not necessarily intuitively, it is with a design plan.
Mm-hmm.
The original sketches or watercolors that I might have for this will already incorporate that to a small degree. So I am altering just what I see a little bit. But notice I only did that after I painted what's in there accurately.
Okay.
This dress is actually more of a formal, or not a formal, just a really basic dress, and we actually took some blue rope and tied it around her in a few different spots to pinch the fabric and create that kind of Victorian drapery dress.
Are you going to spend time on the features in this color sketch, or just
Not at
the
all.
drapery?
No, yeah.
Okay.
This is just going to be very, very quick. I think it's maybe a 10 by 20 canvas, or maybe even an 8 by 16. It's not very big, and typically when you start to reduce down and add a lot of details, you'll end up losing some color quality.
I kind of wish you did spend more time on the features, just because it is coming out really nicely.
Well, a lot of the appeal to these color sketches is that it's just big, bold, direct color, simple shapes, juicy colors. You can tend to lose that when you noodle it a little too much. So that's the whole thing. That gives me enough clarity of idea for where I want to go. I'll actually set up some other fabrics or maybe set up some flowers behind her for the final based off of this. So I'll actually seek out later on some flowers to put in her hair, put behind her to do that.
Mm.
And now it's time to make the canvas. So we're actually including this aspect because it is an important aspect of crafting a painting. And normally, I would suggest you make the canvas the correct size to fit your intent and your design. And so that's exactly what I'm doing here. I'm not just randomly selecting a size because I have it. I've actually thought about how I want this to appear, and so that's how I'm making my canvas. I'm just going to mount some linen here to a gator board. This is a 3/4 inch gator board. It's pretty solid, pretty durable. It would have to take a serious hit to damage it. And since I'm mounting the linen to it, of course, if anything happens to the gator board itself, I will be able to remove the linen and remount it as needed. I'm just going to cut it down here. I'm doing a lot of measuring to make sure I don't make a mistake. This gator board's not exactly really cheap. It's cheaper than some materials, I suppose, but a piece like this is something like $40. So I don't really want to just cut it and make a really big error. The nice thing about Gatorboard, as opposed to something like a wood panel, is that I will be able to do this in the studio with just a razor blade knife. I won't have to pull out any power tools or anything. So I'm going to start by scoring the Gatorboard very lightly, just lightly going down, not pressing too hard. This just creates a tiny little track in the resin impregnated paper backing here. And once that track is established, I'll be able to press a little harder, and the blade will just continue to follow in that track instead of maybe slipping out and creating a different directional chunk. And I'll just keep doing a few passes where I press a little harder and a little harder and a little harder. And it gets to the point where towards the end you don't even really need to use a straight edge because your blade is just following in the track really well. And it just falls right off there. And there's my panel. So I'll have to pull out the frame here. I have the frame already. This was a donation piece for a fundraiser for the Scottsdale Artist School, and they had somebody donate this frame. And so I said, hey, if you let me use the frame, I'll give you a painting for it, and you can sell it at the auction. And so I have this mega massive frame. So the painting was kind of designed with this intent, sort of like a Muka painting for this elaborate kind of frame. So I double-checked to make sure the canvas would fit in, or the panel would fit inside the frame before I move any further. And now I've got my linen roll here, which has been rolled for quite a while, and so it's a little resistant to wanting to be rolled out. Normally I would actually press that for a couple days under some books, but this was done at a time when we were using the studio at the Scottsdale Artist School, and so every other day I had to move all of my stuff to set up the easels to teach, and so I wasn't able to ever leave anything out for an extended period of time. So everything has to be done very fast. You see the anatomy lecture on the wall behind us because that was from the previous day, and I've got today to paint this, and then the next day I've got to teach again. So I won't be able to lay it out, but I'll at least be able to mount it overnight. And so I've cut the canvas down to have an inch or a couple inches around the sides of this, and now I'm going to lay out some glue. This is Lineco. It's Lineco, Lineco glue. It's a PVA glue, PVA being a polyvinyl acetate, kind of like Elmer's glue, except that it's a neutral pH, not acidic, so it's not going to wear down on your materials over time. And I'll just coat this whole panel with this glue. A lot of times what you'll notice is that with gator board and a lot of woods actually, it can sometimes be so absorbent that this first coat that's being laid down will sometimes get sucked right into the panel, and you may end up realizing that by the time you get to applying glue to the far side, the original side is all dry, and so you're not able to use it, and you have to do another coat here. So that's actually what I'm going to end up doing here. That first coat really sucked in, so it's time to do a second coat. Notice I don't want any buildup. I'm actually trying to lay this down really, really thin, really give special attention to the edges and the corners. And I'm using a putty knife here, a big 4-inch putty knife, to really spread it out as smooth as I can. I would recommend the putty knife over a brush. The brush is going to leave streaks, which will potentially show up in your canvas, and it won't go as quickly or as smoothly on as a putty knife will. I've got the linen, time to lay it out. The glue is not going to stay wet for very long. You could use something like an acrylic dispersion gel, which is a little harder to find, to be able to have a little more open time, but in this case we've got maybe 30 seconds to a minute, so I'm trying to work pretty quickly here. I've laid down some sheets of paper, and now I'm using a brayer to just roll out from the middle towards the sides here, and really just try to smash this canvas down onto the panel. Forcefully, but not so strong it would destroy any texture. It's just a firm action. And what we'll actually see here is that the canvas is so rolled, it's been in its roll too long, that it's not going to be planted firmly. It's still going to come up a little bit after I do all of this brayer. But that's not something that makes it unworkable. It just means that I'll remove the linen, and I'll add a little bit more glue, because the glue will pretty much be dry at that point. And there's already now at this point some glue on the back of the linen, which will make it a little stiffer. And so I'll just add another coat of glue to the panel and then rebrayer, and then that'll be enough.
How long do you think it was in the roll for, and how long is too long?
Okay, so too long is a year.
Okay.
Well, that's sort of the upper limit requirement. And sometimes if you get a roll of linen from a manufacturer that is really, really difficult to unroll, it could mean that they potentially pulled one from the back of the shelf and gave it to you when they haven't sold in a while. This particular linen was, again, something the school gave to me because I think somebody died in Scottsdale, and so somebody called the school and said, we had all this stuff, would you like this stuff? And then they came and dropped it off, and then the school said, hey, you can use this linen for this painting that you're going to donate to us. So luckily, the only cost I had to put into the painting was hiring the model and actually applying or paying for the gator board. So that's it. The canvas was left there for a day. I actually did have to go back afterwards and do another coat not too long after, and then I laid the books on, and we're good to go. And now we're several days later, and it's time to actually start the painting. I'm going to begin very similar to how we would with a drawing. You know, I've stepped back until I can sight size this composition to match the cropping of my original color sketch, and I keep stepping back and locking in to her head at this point, and also from her head down to her bottom where she's touching the stool. And that's my lock-in point, and then I take all my other measurements and my width measurements. There I am locking in and adjusting, locking in. I'm trying to lock in, lock in, lock in. And now I've locked in, and now I make my mark. Lots of locking in. A lot of people, a lot of students bypass the lock-in stage. Notice too, I laid it in, I locked in and got the correct width and realized it was a smidge over to the right too far, and then so I adjusted both my width marks a little bit over to get a better placement before I started, because I need all of this placed really well. And we're going to see that I do my outer tick marks for the torso, which I already have. Now I'm doing my box for the head. You know, nothing new from drawing. It's all going to flow very, very similar to how we would do a drawing. Box and placement for, in this case, the hands, so I can make sure I get the arc of the arm correctly, which, spoiler alert, ends up getting repainted anyway. Just trying to get some of the major scheme now. And I should have a pretty good feel by the end of this of what I want the overall painting or gesture of the pose to look like. Important to get this in, especially if you can, in the first 20 minutes, because after that, the model will start to relax, shifts will start to happen, and unfortunately, as we'll see later on in the course of the video, I don't catch a relaxation, and so I miss out on a big gestural portion of the arm, and that's why it needs to get repainted later on. But at least I'm trying to capture as much as I can here in this first little bit to really knock down and get the bigger tilts, bigger angles, bigger proportions, and bigger placements. Next to me painting is a professional artist named James Jung. He shows in Trailside Gallery, mostly known for his Western art. He is an artist who is from China and studied at the Guangzhou Academy over there, which is sort of the country's school for sort of training some of the best artists who have made the biggest names in as far as Chinese painters go in the art world that we know of, selling really high dollar stuff at auction. I've spoken with a lot of Chinese artists about the selection process and how that school operates, and it's actually quite interesting. They're highly invested in advancing their artistic and oil painting skills as a nation, and they essentially seek out the most promising 10 or 12 students and pay for all of their education and supplies and living expenses for a few years, 4 or 5 years. And they train under their master artists there, and that gives them the train some of the best Chinese artists. We found that it was a little too tough for her to continue that pose for too long, so we're sort of seeing what we can do to kind of accommodate her a little bit. This doesn't bother me at all because I'm going to proceed through this painting one section at a time. I'm going to completely paint her head, and then I'm going to move on to the next section, and then the next section. Someone like James over here, who's doing the all-over build-up, is going to have a little bit more trouble with something like this because he's used to bouncing all around the painting and developing it as a whole. And so it's sometimes a little more difficult for painters like that to zero in and try to just paint one area out all the way because they're used to this sort of all-over build-up. Getting a little closer here, so you can see as I start to zero in on the portraiture, I'm going with an open grisaille approach, at least for the head, and actually then you'll see an abache approach, if I'm not mistaken, or a full color body block in for the arm, and then you'll see a more thin abache approach for the rest of the painting. So you're actually going to see me block in or execute this painting with 3 different underpainting styles throughout this painting, which is kind of interesting because it kind of becomes a collective and demonstrates how I'm utilizing all of my more academic style of painting in some areas and my more impressionistic style of other areas to sort of merge them to become the vision that I want to happen in this painting. I'm utilizing some burnt sienna ultramarine blue mixture to produce sort of a neutral color that shifts between warm and a little bit more neutral or cool. And I should be able to hit a lot of the values that I need to match the model here. I didn't tone this canvas. You'll note sometimes I do for these, but if I do, which is a little less common, but sometimes I do, and if I do, it's a very, very, very light toning because I intend to use a lot of transparencies later on. Just remember, if you don't tone your canvas, you need to make sure that if you're doing an underpainting stage like this, that you really get some value established on your flesh tone as early as possible, especially in the lights, because the tendency is always to kind of gauge the lights and darks of your portrait against the surrounding canvas that's there, and thus people go in too light with the lights and then even too light with the darks. And we have to remember that flesh tone hovers around a value range in the lights of 7 or 8, and then in the darks something like anywhere from 4 to 6, something like that. So we need to remember that the flesh tone should not be like 9s, which is actually kind of what they're at right now, which is like an off-white. That is far too light. That's the value of our highlights, and so we need to make sure that the values get built in deep enough and dark enough. I'm using some bristle brushes right now with a little bit of thinner in there to just block in some of the bigger shapes, paper towel to erase out some of the lights, and then I'll go in towards the later stages of this, and we'll use less and less medium as I build up more of a value modulation in the actual face. Notice I'm concerning myself with edges right away too. I'm keeping some of the harder edges, like the cast shadow over the nose, the eyelashes there, where it becomes kind of a cast shadow, keeping them harder now, so that as I build up a value relationship set, I also am maintaining and building up an edge relationship set. And this is something we've seen throughout the whole span of all of the painting videos here. An important consideration that if you do not lock in onto the correct edge structure, your values will suffer because you're going to overcompensate with values to try and get the pop and the luminosity that's created largely because of edges or because of the interaction between edges and values. So it's important to not just treat them in isolation, but to instead at least key them or set them up together, both your edges and your values. I'm knocking in some of the darker darks, and you'll see me do this quite often. I can really identify how dark her hair is, notwithstanding the whiteness of the canvas. So if I pop that really, really dark hair in right now, then the light face will stand out as too light, and I'll be able to go in as I'm doing now and start to deepen some of those values.
And why don't you tone the whole canvas?
Later on, you'll see that there are some transparencies that I'm wanting to get with the background and with the dress, that if I tone something a little too warm or a little too dark, won't read as rich and luminescent. Okay. So sometimes I do on these, but if I do, it's a very, very light, neutral, kind of off-white with some variation. Feeling pretty confident now in my no-tan of the face, and so I'm starting to build up a little more value relationship. Still with, again, a relatively large bristle brush. I'm trying to make significant changes. And already you can start to see how some of the colors are sinking in. We've sped this video, again, way up. I think this is overall or total, this is something like a 4.5, 5 hour video, and this is a 7-session painting. And so, the amount of time I'm with the model is 21 hours, and we've blasted it into 4 or 5 hours. So we're seeing things really, really quick. Now, there are a lot of breaks with the model, so we might only have, a total of 16 hours or so of painting. Or maybe 18 hours of painting. So we're only sped up, 4 or 5 times, but we're seeing this all happen very, very quickly. So we're actually a pretty decent amount into this already. Well, maybe not, maybe 30, 40 minutes into this painting, and you can see how the darks that I laid down initially for the hair, for example, are already starting to get so light because the turp is evaporating, and I'm no longer seeing the true values there. And so will have to build up a little bit more, not necessarily body paint, but it is paint that's not modified with thinner. It's just laid on thinly, delicately, to be able to hit some of the darker darks. Now, luckily, when we're doing this in class here and only meeting once a week, or when I'm working in a studio like this and every other day I have to teach, that means my painting gets time to dry in between sessions. So, when we looked at the 3-day figure painting in the last video, it was a week between each of those blocks. So everything was really dry on the painting between then. Here it might have been a couple days between this session and what will be the next session, but what will happen is I can lay in more direct paint to actually get true values in my underpainting, so that when I come back later on, it'll be pretty close to what the values should literally be, and I won't have to deal with too much of the sinking in. Because essentially, whenever something sinks in or that turp evaporates and it gets lighter like that, I'm going to have to go in and repaint it again. So I'd rather not do it, but it's a safer way to start out with thinner paint. Because as you can see, I'm erasing with that eraser, and I can do that because I've thinned out the paint and made it more like a charcoal, more like a powdered pigment on there with very little binder. You'll find that with an underpainting like this, it's actually easier to make more delicate shapes with your eraser than with the paintbrush. So it's actually kind of the reverse of drawing. When we were drawing, our eraser was nice, but it made things shapes a little too blunt and a little too undescriptive. And now that's going to be what happens with the paintbrush. So we have to sometimes work more with a subtractive method if we're shooting for finer detail than with an additive method. I noticed that my mouth wasn't in quite the right spot or quite the right angle to the face, so I just knocked that all down. And then we'll try to sink that in a little bit. Right now I also have a connection issue between the neck and the head. The head isn't quite sitting on there to reflect the posture and the tilt in correct relation to the body. But I am not going to address that for a while. I want to get a pretty solid head painted in there, and then I'll adjust some of the attachment points, which will adjust some of the perspective and tilts as we get towards the final. And then things will start to look a little better. And that's, again, one of those things we've talked about in some of the prior videos about just a little more self-control to not bounce around outside of where you really need to be working. The head is the most relevant thing right now, not the immediately surrounding areas of anatomy. And if I can really zero in on some of the subtleties of the head tilts that we're looking at here, I'll more accurately be able to hit some of the major muscle shapes of the neck leading into the back. So I'm going to shy away from this. And this is actually pretty common to what Solomon instructs on how to draw a figure, as opposed to the methods that we've been dealing with, where we start with a box and then scheme out the whole figure and then whittle it down from there, or scheme out the box and then or scheme out the figure and then go to a torso box and resolve that and then add the head and limbs on. Solomon actually instructs to knock the head in, draw the head really well, and then from there you can get a strong attachment point using the trapezius and the sternocleidomastoid into the torso, and from there work down the figure and adjust the tilts of the body to kind of match the head and make sure you get the gesture. The problem with that, of course, is most people jumping into this program don't have a lot of experience with portrait, so they would spend the entire time, as we've said before, working on a head instead of the torso. The other issue with that is one of the most common big blunders that students have made, both in my class and in just about any class I've ever taught or attended, is the subtle size shifting of the head by the time it's done being rendered means that the figure is cut off at a very inappropriate spot on the canvas, like right at the ankles or right at the toes, something that looks not intentional, not purposeful. And so the methods that we work now sort of forces us into considering how the cropping is and ensuring that we have enough room for everything to work out correctly. And then, if you find that you have a more control in being able to render out the head and it doesn't grow too much or shrink too much, there's nothing wrong in a drawing with starting with the head and rendering it out and then just moving forward from there. And in fact, you'll produce more pieces that look like finished pieces that way, or at least intentionally finished pieces that way, because instead of having a torso with some partially finished limbs and no head, you'll have a head that just kind of blossoms out into a torso, and you can gently fade it away if you need to, and at very least you'll end up with a portrait and possibly a portrait and partial figure painting, and that tends to look nice. It's very sort of Schmid-looking painting. So here I'm really trying to zero in on the head. At this point in the program, you should have had at least some feature training with portraits, hopefully, and you've been doing a lot of drawing already with the previous year. So you should be able to at least draw a head. You should have the understanding of how to place the figure on the canvas. So with successful portrait drawing, there's no reason why you can't do something like this right away. And so you should be able to jump in this method, if you'd like, for the figure painting. do your color studies and your planning the first day, and jump in the second day with the actual head. Looking at the timeline, this would put us about the halfway point for the term. You're in week 5 when this is happening right now, which is actually kind of when you're starting your longer portraits in the analogous portrait painting class, which is of course following all those anatomy studies. So you should have the features of the face. So you should have a pretty good understanding of how you would want to proceed from here after all those feature studies. If you're working at home also, it's not necessarily a bad idea to just do one block or one course at a time. There's no reason to really need to do portrait painting and figure painting simultaneously. It makes a lot of sense to start with portrait painting and then move up to figure painting, because figure painting includes the portrait. And that's why this kind of represents our final video, which is the end, accumulation of everything that we've done in the program and trying to put it all together, creating atmospheric and perspective effects, and utilizing our knowledge of anatomy and our skills of drawing and color and everything to produce a cohesive piece in this final project. A lot of use with the eraser. Because I'm working on linen that's mounted to a board, I can be a lot more abrasive with the eraser, which I really, really like. This level of scumbling and erasing is a little harder to do when this is on a stretched canvas. Not impossible, but just you have to be a little more delicate. And I would probably have to be using more of a maul stick or a cane to brace my hand, as opposed to now when I'm working on a panel, I can really just slam my hand right up there and go right to town with it.
Could you also do this drawing with a drawing originally and then transfer?
Yeah, absolutely, and you should be keeping that in mind, whatever your process has been thus far throughout everything. If you've been doing preparatory drawings, which I highly recommend actually, and transferring them, then there's no reason to all of a sudden jump into a slightly more direct style of working. You do a shadow map of the face, and when it really looks like the person, transfer that, because then you'll be also certain that it will fit into the canvas the correct size. There won't be any growth or shrinkage that you need, or that might affect the rest of the figure. Yeah, remember, this is just one way of doing a painting, and it's certainly not expected that when just after watching this video you're able to do a figure painting like this and of this size in this amount of time. That's pretty unreasonable. You only have a shot at it if you've watched the other videos and done the other projects, and you've built up the skill level thus far. And even if this is not your working method, then you shouldn't expect to all of a sudden at the very end switch that up. You really need to be continuing on with what your approach that you've been working in. We'll get to see a little bit of lots of approaches in this one, which is nice. So it'll kind of apply to just about everything, except for the closed grisaille underpainting, which we don't actually do in this one. Going in with some deeper values, trying to broaden my range of darks. Really want to try and get as close as I can to the values that I'm seeing on the model in something like this. Especially if I have a little more time. I'm not having to paint a whole lot of the actual torso and flesh tone, in here, aside from the face and the arm and the hand, which means I can spend a little more time proportionally on the head to get that right. So, a day for the underpainting of the head and a day for the color is a good ratio to the amount for the rest of the painting. The whole painting kind of is hinged off of and keyed off of this initial area. These little bits I'm going in here with now, that's basically just the cleanup. I'm dipping into just a little bit of paint and then working it into some of the areas to even out the transitions and tones. And that, of course, will just let me go in with some finer value judgments and finer detail judgments. And, this level of detail, remember, isn't even necessary. This is just one way of doing it. The last figure painting we saw, the underpainting was very, very simple comparatively to this. It was basically a 3-value kind of thing. I didn't even really need the model up there to do it because I had the shadow map from earlier. And from that shadow map, I just made a basic underpainting and then painted on top of that. That is certainly an approach that we could utilize here. This is just going to allow me to do a more confidently tiled approach where each thing I lay down is going to be quite a bit more direct than the last painting that we saw, where I laid down bigger areas and then slowly refined them. This is going to be much more with the intent of trying to lay a stroke down, and it's pretty much the color and shape and value that I want it to be before moving on. Dakota has has some nice round full features here, which from certain angles are very sort of idealistic, and then from other angles you have to be careful because they get over rounded very fast. And this is a case where if you're really not careful with the cheeks, really not careful with the chin and even the lips and even the nose, and things can get a little too bubbly, and then she can start to look quite a bit more cartoony. And so this is something I have to be aware of, especially after having worked with her in this pose for so long. I have a much better understanding of the danger here, and so I'm continually cutting in anything that's looking a little too round. I'm continually sort of like chopping down, like I just did with that forehead there, and trying to go back and keep and make sure all of my lines are very, very straight as I build this up to ensure that things don't get too round and too bubbly. That effort's a little harder with females who tend to have softer and rounder features in general. If I was doing this portrait alone without James over on my side, I would actually be letting her relax her whole body to do this portrait, because that would, this is a very demanding pose. She is shifting quite a bit, which makes this portrait pretty demanding. I think this is probably even more difficult to paint than the video we saw with Martina. And with her, we were actually letting her talk and be a little more relaxed. But it was much easier for her to get back into the pose that was required. Whereas this, she's leaning forward, even though she's kind of got that stool there, she's still leaning forward and having to adjust and not get too uncomfortable. And so this head is really kind of on a bobble swivel, and I'm having to constantly go back and adjust some of the tilts and angles to it. If it was just me working on this painting, I would definitely let her be just in a regular chair, regular pose, and actually twist her body to whatever position is comfortable enough to allow her to maintain the subtle tilt and sort of lifted chin kind of angle that she's got, and then just go back and paint the rest of it later on.
I noticed that earlier when we saw James's painting next to yours, his already seemed to have a lot of the figure addressed early on. Do you know why that would be in his working method?
Well, remember I had already done the color study in the step before, and that he was actually working along with me when I was doing the color study. He was just working on his painting directly already without any preparatory work. So those big strokes and big shapes he had laid in were what he was doing while I was doing the color study, and that's kind of a common approach from where he came from in China, which is that all-over blocking kind of thing. But he did have, an extra session with the model where I was figuring out more of my color and design. He was actually just throwing the paint on there already, so he had a little bit of a head start on it. I've found, though, that especially on these larger pieces, for me at least, that the more planning I do, the less issues I run into later on. And I don't end up with a piece that's potentially unfinished because all of my timing is well thought out. I know how much time I have to work on each section to be able to get things done. Whereas, I don't think James ended up finishing his painting. With that type of painting style, it's kind of you work it and work and do passes and passes until it looks good. And so if you end up getting to a point where you don't have access to the model anymore and you can't finish it, then it's just unfinished, and you end up with a lot of unfinished paintings. That's Richard Schmidt's whole alla prima argument. If you do things directly, finish it one section at a time, if the model leaves, you can kind of work with that and sort of mold that into a painting, versus having just a lot of unfinished stuff in the studio.
Yeah.
Until you get really comfortable in understanding all of the concepts of shape, value, edge, and then also really working with and handling models, I don't really recommend an overall approach to painting, just because it's very difficult to understand what's, like we've spoken about before, what you need to fix and what you're just chasing, and even just verbalizing with the model and helping them get back into the right pose and not being too demanding of the model so they can continue to hold that pose. There's a lot of other things that go into it. The more a model tends to shift and move, the less I want to work all over. The more I'll work one section at a time. And then I can just do the next piece of anatomy attached to what I did before, and then just using my knowledge of anatomy, make sure it all works out. We're even doing a painting in class this week where we have the model sitting on a stool, and I painted the top half of the model, and then when I got down to the hips, the position had changed, but it was better. The hips kind of made a more dramatic curvature, and because I hadn't committed to too much of the overall painting and too much of the overall underpainting and drawing, I was able to just adjust the hips, and so now the painting is better for it. I was able to select a more dynamic posture and just fold that into what I had already, as opposed to having to completely repaint entire sections of the painting.
Will that usually happen with a model where the pose gets more dynamic rather
No,
than...
it almost always gets less dynamic. I think it's incredibly rare. The only situation where I think that really happens is towards the end of a session with the model, after you've been working with the model for 4 or 5 days, and right in the last 10 or 15 minutes, they get that energy boost, and that's when they start to take that really dynamic pose, and that's usually what they were in the first 15 minutes of the pose, originally at the beginning of the week, but nothing like how they've been the rest of the time. But you just have to work with it. What we're going to see here, I'm finishing up this drawing here. We actually lost a little bit of footage with this video where I started to lay in some of the color of the face here coming up, so you're going to see us transition over to a face partially done. But we can kind of look at what we have here and dissect how it was being painted. You can see I'm laying in some tiles. I'm trying to be pretty direct as I was with the Martina portrait video. You can see that's very much how the forehead was painted. We can even see little speckles of underpainting showing through on the forehead. What's happening on the lower portion of the face, however, is I'm having to do a little bit more build-up, mostly because the value structure of my underpainting, my open grisaille, wasn't deep enough to truly reflect all of the value changes that existed on the model. And so if I left the paint film too open, I think the underpainting would have been too light to gently fold into the paint going on top of it. and it wouldn't read as clean with the transitions of value. And so I'm laying on paint actually exactly how paint was being laid down on our 3-session figure painting here. And so this is paint that's body paint. There is no medium in it. So the intent is that I'm using these stiffer brushes. I've got some rosemary badger brushes for the nose in here, and then every once in a while I might dip into a bristle brush if I need a little bit more of a paint load. But I'm just applying more and more and more paint. The idea being that once I get something that looks pretty similar to what's up there, I'm going to soften it down, knock it down, and then add some final details. So this is actually a lot, or very similar to how James was approaching his painting. This idea of, pure paint, building it up, and then softening it out, and then building more paint as needed. The difference here is that I have more of my drawing worked out, so this is really much more of a focus on color while fine-tuning some of the values in the painting. I'm still using a larger brush here, and then I'll work towards a smaller brush, and still refining the drawing. Notice, as I'm laying the paint in here, I'm not being completely slavish to my underpainting if I've noticed my underpainting has an error in it. In this case, the upper lip had a little bit of an error. It wasn't quite low enough, it wasn't quite thick enough, and so I had to adjust that. And then moving down to some of the other areas, it's still adjusting the cheek, adjusting the lower lip, blocking in colors, probably a little more chromatic than they need to be, but once they get softened down, they will lower in chroma a little bit. So I'm not too concerned at this point. A lot of stepping back, though, and letting my eyes go out of focus, not just squinting, but really letting my eyes go out of focus to see the color blob of her head here versus the color blob of the model, and making sure that they kind of look similar there. It's really trying to seek out the transition color. I'm picking up on some greens, especially towards the bottom part of the face. This is where it gets kind of tricky here because that's describing all of the turning of the jaw, and it's very, very subtle. But we are getting some color bouncing up from the dress, the fabric, up into her face. So I'm having to paint that in there. We saw that pretty strongly indicated on James's painting. I think he intended on going back and knocking it down, but even I put it in pretty strongly here. And eventually, as the painting gets more and more developed, it'll become more and more subtle. So it really doesn't even become noticeable. If it becomes so noticeable that it's distracting, then you really need to take it down and fold it back into the rest of the painting. His mouths are tricky. I think most people agree that the mouth is one of the hardest parts to paint of a portrait. But notice that I'm not trying to push the paint that I have there to get the right shape. I'm correcting the drawing by adjusting the color. And so it's a dual kind of concept that will increase the color quality of your paintings. If you don't feel you're quite advanced enough to do that, then certainly just do whatever you need to fix the drawing. And by drawing, I don't just mean shape, I mean shape, value, and edge. Those are all very much linked together. You can get away with colors that aren't as chromatic, aren't as vibrant, as long as your shape, value, edge is good. This is certainly was my approach in Chicago when the lights we were working under were so dim that it was very difficult to actually see enough of your painting to be able to identify color very easily. So a lot of the paintings end up being a little more monochromatic, a lot less colorful, because you can see the shape, value, edge a little easier than the color. I'm painting her under a white light. That's important to note. We've talked about this before. White light does not breed a significant color temperature change in the shadows. It's just whatever color is bouncing into the shadows is bouncing into the shadows. So in some instances I have greens. Some instances I have, I think, a little bit of cooler blue from the window on the right that I think we might have one window open. Some instances it's warm, where the light is bouncing off the flesh tone and then back into the shadow. So, we've got a whole big range of color temperatures and local colors in the shadow. So I don't want to be slavish to any rule in this case. I do enjoy painting people under white light because it tends to stand out as more realistic immediately, because we tend to have, at least in the studio, we have white lights everywhere in the studio. So when you look at people in the studio, they're under a white light, so thus you're seeing their local colors. And then when you paint somebody like that, then when they glance over at the canvas, it looks like they might be a real person standing over there because they're under a white light situation, just like everyone else walking around. This particular approach, keep in mind, is what I would consider a little bit more on the advanced side. So only do this kind of bouncing around and molding the whole thing up together if you are feeling very, very comfortable with color, because it's really easy to slip an incorrect color or incorrect value in an area, and really ruin a lot of the buildup you have there. So spend a lot of time mixing if this is your intent. So, we can see just here, just like with many other videos, how much less time the brush is up there versus the brush is down. Remember, this is sped up like 4 or 5 times, so there's still a lot of mixing going on the canvas for each little bit of stroke up there. If you are less confident in your color mixing skills, certainly do more of a closed grisaille approach. If you are kind of confident in your color mixing skills, I would say an open grisaille approach, and then tiling the color on top, one section at a time. And then if you're really confident in your color approach or your color mixing skills, you can feel free to bounce around a little bit more. If you're really confident in both your drawing and your color skills, you can dispense with the underpainting and just start throwing color in there. You'll note the white and black paint next to the model's face. That certainly won't stay there forever. That's just to key my portrait. Something we've seen before in some of the other videos. I really want a standard white and a standard black there to understand my value range and limitations. At this point, I'm getting enough on here where it becomes more of a flick my eyes back and forth and try and find the difference. And I'll keep doing that, moving around the painting, starting with areas that I think or deem to be the most different from the reference, and then trying to resolve that a little bit, and then moving over to an area that is the next most wrong area, and then continuing to do that and bounce around until, essentially, in the case of a limited time frame like this, I reach the limits to how long I'm able to resolve and correct and refine. My color mixing system for this painting is the 5 groups of red, yellow, and blue. So that at least limits my uh, possibility of getting inaccurate values as I jump from place to place if I really just think about the value first and then go to that group of red, yellow, and blue. And then for the most part, at least on the painting, the color family of each stroke is pretty easy to identify. You know, with the painting, we can really just zero in on one stroke and it's an obvious color family. Sometimes on a model, it becomes more difficult because the transition between one color family and another can be so small and so subtle that a little area can take on the appearance of multiple color families. But for jumping around here, you know, using that five value system really makes it easy to lock in and modify. Now I'm coming in here with my Langnickel 5590. Nowadays I would use my Rosemary Badger brush for this to go and soften some edges, smooth out my paint. Remember, this is pure body paint. Um, it's creamy. You know, I'm not using any really stiff brands here. I have a variety of brands, but for the most part they're very buttery. So they're still softenable, but if I were to use something even nowadays like a comber to do this, the comber would be a little too soft to get these areas to kind of melt together like they're doing. So I would instead use a Rosemary Badger brush, the Master's Choice, with that nice soft tip, and that would just drive some of these colors together, get nice smooth transitions here. If I were working with a more open paint film here, which I think was the original intent, then I would be able to use a comber because the paint there would be so subtle and so fine and so thin, really, that it would be easy to soften out. These edges here on the bottom, as I get towards the jaw, are really going to help adjust the focal point and help push the jaw down and under, being softer, while leaving in this case, the nose and the eye a little sharper. That'll help give me just that little bit of perspective on the face. And so this is actually something that you learn when working from photos, actually. A photo can do this really well. If you take a photo of somebody where your focus is on the eyes and the nose, you'll see how the mouth and forehead where it meets the hair are ever so slightly softened out. And it's something that's so subtle that if you're working from life, because your eyes can bounce around and adjust so easily, you would not notice. But it does add a nice level of realism to a painting when you're able to do that. And so using this knowledge of how optical perspective works, and this knowledge that the nose and, for example, the eyebrow are closer to me than the jaw and the top of the forehead where it's wrapping back towards the hair, I'm ever so subtly softening out some edges to enhance that roundness and enhance that dimensionality that just wasn't really there when I laid the tiles on. Now I could probably continue to lay paint on for another few hours and achieve some of these edge or these transition effects, and that's just because I'd be bringing colors and values closer together. But at this point in the painting, I feel that the values and colors are close enough together that, and the paint is set up enough that I can do those softening techniques without actually blending the paint and ruining the colors and values in the transitions. So there's a little bit of experimentation required with your materials. And even with your climate, you know, it changes from temperature and humidity to temperature and humidity when that paint sets up and it's ready to be softened. And certainly the brush you choose will make an impact on that. And now that the head is softened a little bit more, I can go back in. I'm getting my smaller brushes here, some really tiny Badger brushes, and hitting some smaller details. Actually, that's a sable in there. I'll move towards little tiny sables in some paintings for just the little bitty details now. Notice I didn't even really soften up the nose. I certainly didn't soften the highlights on the nose. I probably will at some point, but I do want them to foil against the softness of the other areas of the painting. We're at a little bit different of an angle with the camera, so the drawing's a little more skewed than it was in the last shot. But you can still get a better understanding of some of the colors that I'm laying in here. Not a lot of changes that were made in those. They're just little tiny pieces. That's all that was needed. And now I'm actually carving back in with a little bit of background, but this background is really, really thin, just using some mineral spirits on here. I want to keep that background really thin until I'm ready to paint it in the color that I want, but I do want to use that background to carve in and cut into the head. You know, I worked with the whole idea of the Sargent technique of painting just a little bit into, past where that head needs to be, and then working that background back into the head. And that helps with this idea of integration that is a really challenging idea for students to overcome, where their work kind of looks cut out and pasted against the background. And you really don't want that. You want it to look like it flows sort of in and out of the background. And a lot of that happens with broken edges. You can see all along the right side of the face how by dragging that brush down there, it sort of broke up the edge just a little bit while I carved it in. Same thing with the hair. I was able to keep all those edges in the hair for now pretty sharp, yet it still looks kind of out of focus because of how I dragged the brush over there and spliced some of the background into it and broke up some of those edges. So this is a nice setup, I think, for a second pass in the painting. And this second pass could be done either the same day or an additional day. It just depends on what your skills are as far as speed. And so don't rush it. I mean, this, especially if you're working in this sort of method, the whole idea is that you want things to be accurate and really, really strong before you proceed. And if worst case comes to worst case, we just crop this off and it becomes a really nice portrait.
On that big of a panel, or you?
Well, yeah, the panel is nice because you can always cut it down, and then just use the rest of the panel for something else. If this were stretched, it'd be a little more tricky because essentially the stretcher bars are only good the size they are. But that is one of the benefits of the Gator board panels. Notice in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see my color sketch there. That's actually what that is. It's just hanging out there, giving me a guideline to my colors to make sure that I'm seeing things correctly. It's just another guiding tool, as though I were looking at a master copy and then looking at the model, trying to see how to lay down the strokes. This is looking at the color study and then looking at the model to kind of guide my understanding of colors that are up there. You know, we do see things in a color sketch that's a very short amount of time that we don't see in a longer painting where we're spending more time staring at it. You know, we see these tiny little lighting effects, especially with the blues and greens at halftones. You know, you just glance up there and you kind of see them when you look at the model, and then they kind of disappear when you look longer at the model. So if you want to include some of those effects, it's a good idea to have your color sketch on hand. It's typically more of an impressionistic idea, you know, some of this optical broken color that comes together to form the dimensionality of the head versus, you know, really spending a ton of time painting the exact color and exact value transitions that are there, which might give the viewer the same fleeting color effects when they glance at your painting, but on closer inspection they won't really see as many of those colors, you know, whereas the idea here is something like the viewer gets a little closer and they see, oh wow, I didn't notice that green at the halftone and that really sparkly blue over here. That's interesting. for the most part, using body paint at this stage, but maybe just a little bit of oil in some of these areas, just to help the strokes fold into the the base color a little more easily without having to blend it all the time. I think that's one of the great things about using the Richard Mayer medium, the 5 parts thinner, 1 part sand, 1 part Damar, because that sand oil acts as a leavening agent, so your strokes kind of blend into each other as you go. You know, the problem there is that we couldn't build that up over multiple days. I think we do end up spending 3 days on this head total. So the first day was the underpainting. I think this actually right now might be the second day of color on the face. Especially if we look at, we're going at 4 times or 5 times the speed, that would make sense because we still have another couple hours to go on the space. So we're either into the second day now or approaching the second day here. So I'm not really trying to rush the head. I do want to bring it to a pretty high level of finish here. And it is, I think the anchor for the rest of the painting. But I do have to think about that a little bit before I start laying the paint on so that I can select the appropriate medium for it. Even though I'm not using that medium that we just talked about for the head, I will use it when I get to the dress in the background, and that will give me a lot more fluidity, a lot more sheen to my paint as I lay it down, and I won't have to build on top of it. And I'm going to hit that all in one direct shot. The canvas that I'm using is a Frederick's oil primed canvas, which I don't commonly use, but it is a little more absorbent than what I'm used to. That's one reason why I opted for opaque paint instead of thinned out paint. Going with really thick paint that I'm softening into the canvas. It also has a little bit more texture than I'm actually accustomed to in a painting, and so the thicker paint helps again to push into the canvas and fill that tooth in just a little bit more, so that in this case the head and then later on the arm will be a little smoother and a little slicker and by comparison to some of the surrounding areas. Also, in some areas, because of the texture of the canvas, even while laying paint in like this, I'm still going to get a little more, a bit more micro variations in color happening on the portrait, which on a slick canvas would not necessarily happen, especially with this style of painting. It's something that we kind of touched on in the last video, where a really slick canvas can produce brushwork that looks a little more chippy, or with edges that have raised. As you press down on the brush stroke, it sort of pushes paint to the side of your brush, and you get these kind of ridges in there. That doesn't happen as much when you're using a canvas that's more textured like this. Notice that area that I just worked in, I laid a bit of color, it was wrong. I mixed a little bit of color later on, it wasn't quite right. Mixed a little color later on. Instead of trying to work that color into the surrounding area, which would destroy the surrounding area, I kept going back to the palette and trying to remix and remix and remix until I got that color to be what I wanted it to be. There are some stages that this portrait takes where some of the marks in there look really strong and really good, like I'm really happy with, that I feel like, oh, that'd be great if I left that. I really like how that works and how that turns the form, and how it's kind of loose and just placed in there, and it really does the job nicely. Where if this were an alla prima painting, I would probably leave some of those things. But this is a situation where I do have more time. I want this to be a little more studied, and just because I like how something is when I laid it down, and just because I like how it looks, I'm not going to leave it necessarily unless it actually is pretty close to what's up there. I have still have quite a bit of time to build up this face, and so I wanted to get closer and closer and closer. And it's kind of like what we spoke about prior, where um, it's much safer to actually paint what is there, what is really there, because then you have a better guideline to understand where something's a little bit more off. And so I'll end up changing some stuff. For example, I really like how the mouth looks right now. It has a good amount of form to it. And some of the strokes on the eye. But ultimately, as the pose goes on, it doesn't quite become as true to what I'm looking at, and so it just needs to be adjusted to be a little more correct, and a little more correct, and a little more correct. And then maybe towards the end, if I decide that, oh yeah, I really liked how it looked the other way, and I have enough painted on there to where I can tell if it's going to be a big influence on those surrounding areas, or if it's not really going to matter, then I can go back in and paint things how I remember liking them before. But you just have to not be afraid to, sometimes come in there and knock down some of those strokes that you like just because you like them, and really try to push harder to see a little more and to paint a little more. I have a really, really tiny synthetic brush right here. I'm not even really sure what it is. It's just some tiny random little brush I found at an art supply store that looked small enough to do some detail work, and so I bought a bunch of them. But I go through these little brushes like crazy. Um, I use them so infrequently, and they don't stand up to my rough abuse very well. As I go in here, I'm laying in some paint, but I'm also actually kind of just breaking up some edges and transitions. Not really softening, but almost like with the eraser in a toned drawing, kind of lifting some areas or splicing some areas of lighter paint into darker paint. So it doesn't end up being a mushy softness. It becomes almost a broken kind of edge transition between the areas, which of course gives the suggestion of a little more texture on the face rather than just being completely smooth or plastic. I am able to get a little more detailed in here than I might in a setting where I have a lot of people painting around with me, because I'm actually pretty close to the model, only 4 or 5 feet away. So I'm able to actually see a lot more information than I would typically see in a class situation or an open studio situation. So that's just allowing me to paint a little further than I might otherwise paint. It's probably worth mentioning, though, that just because you can see more information doesn't really mean you need to paint more information. I'm doing that as a deliberate choice as opposed to just because I'm close enough and I can see more, I'm going to paint more. It's something worth thinking about to have the body of your work have the same feel, the same sort of informational feel at different levels, so that a small painting scales up to a large painting and a large painting scales down to a mid-sized painting. So when people look at the body of your work, it doesn't really first come off that, oh, well, that must be a tiny painting, or oh, wow, that must be a huge painting because it's so detailed. That's something that'll make your work look a little bit more cohesive. And also, people who start to follow you and like your work will like your work of all scales. It won't seem like, oh, well, that one looks too tight, and it only, of course, looks too tight because it's a large painting. Or in the case of small paintings, oh, wow, that looks really too loose for my taste. And if you're able to pick up on this idea of just adjusting your brushstroke size really relative to your subject, so that your large paintings feel like your small paintings and vice versa, I think it adds a nice touch of stylistic, cohesive touch to your body of work. I don't always necessarily do that, but it's largely because I end up painting so many different things in kind of so many different ways and styles that I jump all over, really. And it's really comes down more, at least for me, to what do I think the subject needs to be painted well, as opposed to how do I turn the subject into a painting that looks like it's done by me. But I know that is a concern for a lot of people. They want to have their own style and their own identity and own individuality in the painting. And that is one way to have that, so it doesn't look like a different artist at different sizes of your painting.
That's interesting. What are some other ways that you can have a cohesive body of work?
Aside from the scaling of the brushstroke size, well, I think the way that paint is applied really is probably one of the biggest things. If you end up having some paintings that are so smooth that they have no visible brushwork, and then some paintings that you're using big swooping brushwork all over, it can look like totally different people painted them. So just considering the paint application aspect of it, becomes pretty characteristic. I mean, that's why when we study master copies, that's one of the first things we look at is, what is the paint application of the artist, because it's so revealing. Another thing I think is your color gamut. Once you start to lock in onto colors that you like, and it could even just be colors created by a particular light source. For example, a lot of these paintings that I do with models like this are painted under a white light. And so when you look at painting after painting, it has a similar feel to it. The colors are a certain richness and a certain gamut because of the light source, versus if all of my paintings were done in north light and would have sort of the bluer, softer light, or yellow light and have that warm glow. That it makes things a little more immediately recognizable. Or even the amount of chroma. If all of your paintings are really keyed to a neutral, moody kind of French naturalist look, then it'll have a sort of stylistic or cohesive quality to your body of work. A lot of times what I'll end up doing is, if I know that I'm going to be painting for a show, for example, and I have 10, 20 paintings that I need to do, I might actually, after I figure out the content of what those paintings are, I might explore a series of limited palettes. And those limited palettes might help constrain my colors enough so that even if my paintings are very different, it has the same sort of color feel to it from one painting to another. And that's one way to approach it. And then, of course, there's subject matter. If you want your work to look cohesive, you have paintings of a lot of the same kind of things. Whereas if you're bouncing all over the place, you paint a tiny mouse here and a giant cathedral there, and a figure over here, it tends to potentially not look like the same artist.
Okay.
Especially if you fall into the trap of, oh, I paint buildings this way, and I paint animals this way, and I paint flowers this way. If you have a different technique, like, for example, watching all these videos, it's really easy to fall into this trap. Well, I like how so-and-so paints flowers, and I like how so-and-so paints people, and I like how so-and-so paints landscapes. And then all of a sudden, you paint one thing, and it looks like a completely different artist than when you paint another thing. And there's a real danger associated with that if you're really concerned about your identity in your artwork.
Okay.
I actually really enjoy this stage of paintings sometimes. I mean, it depends on my mood, but there's some days where I really do like to just get a small brush out and slow down and really explore kind of the contours and the delicacy of shapes as they wrap around other shapes. Some days I just feel like I have a lot of energy and I want to just slam everything in. So for me, it's nice to do paintings that incorporate both, or to at least have multiple paintings up. So depending on my mood, I can tackle whichever one I want. Even from a week-to-week basis, working in the studio with students, I tend to do a different painting or drawing style. For me, the class time and the teaching is a way to also explore a different variety of methods while I, instruct and teach on them. And so it's nice when one week, I feel like doing an academic graphite pencil drawing that's very smooth, and then another week I do really loose, big brush figure painting that's very abstract, and then another week I do something that's maybe a combination of both, or graphite or white chalk. I get to go all over the place and just really kind of push the boundaries, because here we teach so many different styles of things, so that my mood can be satisfied from week to week or even day to day, while I'm giving demonstrations and instruction on different things. But it's not something I would really encourage for the first couple years, bouncing around from subject to subject. But eventually, if you start to get more comfortable, doing one thing, you may have an intellectual need to satisfy that coaxes you into different areas of painting and drawing style. As I lay these strokes down in the light, I am, again, just like with our white chalk drawings, following the direction of the form with and against the form, helping to coax out just a little more dimensionality in the face. Compared to those strokes on the right side and shadow of the face, where they're all pretty much uniform direction. It's difficult to tell, but I really did get some thick impasto on that forehead highlight. And I'm actually going in and carving some color around it, which darkens the value just ever so slightly right around the rim and helps it pop out as a harder edge and a brighter highlight. And that's similar to what we might do in drawing, taking an HB pencil around a really light highlight to crisp that highlight up. At this point, I kind of feel like the head is there, like almost as though it's a real head sitting there, and I'm just painting on somebody's face and doing just subtle modifications um, on somebody's head while doing this, which is kind of an interesting, kind of fun thing. It feels a little more natural to paint a head this way. I'm not sure why. But I can get these tiny little subtle transitions now. It's, again, almost like filling in with a drawing, the cleanup stage with a drawing, where I'm just really finding some paint, some color, some value to facilitate that transition between forms to soften out those colors without actually blending them. So that's why, we get all these, in that forehead, all those subtle varieties of color in there that don't look splotchy, really. That splotchiness comes when you don't have an adequate transition from color to color. And if you just blend it, as opposed to finding these transitions, it might make the portrait look, I don't know, wavy or dented, I think is a good word, and that's like a subtle incorrect value transition. Just kind of splotchy or even bruised, even. That mouth is, something we talked about a lot before. It can get kind of tricky. We see all these hard edges when we look at a mouth, and we have to make sure we break up some of those hard edges if we can, especially that top lip going into the area right above it. At a glance or from a distance, it can appear as a very hard edge, and you can paint it that way, but you have to make sure it's a broken hard edge, and then it facilitates that softer transition. Otherwise, if you get that edge too hard, it really looks like maybe they're wearing lipstick, or it's just too flat and graphic. I won't really have enough time in this session to even paint the ear out. Not even really much of the neck. It's just I'm trying to get context so I can finish this face up in this last little bit here. The ear, especially here, since I want the outer perimeters of the painting to be a little bit more abstract, and because the ear falls in the scope of the hair mass in this case, I am going to keep it a little looser and potentially vary the paint application a little bit more than I am doing in the head. And this is a kind of a common approach for me doing these larger paintings, especially when I'm intending to do a lot of thick versus thin in the background, a lot of abstraction in the background. I only typically block the hair in kind of suggestively, very, very thinly, and then usually the ear kind of the same way. And then I'll actually tie that all in together when I paint the background. I'll go back in and restate the hair. So really I only end up painting the transition between the forehead and the hair now, and then the hair acts as my transition between the background and the portrait, so that I don't end up having to work the background into a really dry area, which I'll have to do on the right side of the face, unfortunately, which means I may end up needing to come back later on and repaint a little bit of the right side of the face here so that I can integrate it into the background, depending on how things go. But at least having the hair as a frame for the face means that I can think about all of that thick and thin paint application much later on. And even in an alla prima session, I would do this as well. Depending, because I might not know how I want to handle the background, so I would leave the hair a little bit thinner, and then maybe if I end up getting to paint the background, and I might come back and readdress the hair so that there's a sort of a step down between the buildup of the face and the buildup of the hair, and then the buildup of the background. Again, that's sort of that integration idea. I don't want it to look like the hair is cut out and pasted on the background. And this tiny little brush is great for finding those little micro transitions. If you look really close, even in some of the areas on the chin, you can see kind of tiny little hatch marks that are bringing the light side of the chin into the dark side. And you really have to look close to see it, but they definitely are there. There's a lot of visible brush work here, even as I advance this to a more modeled state. My intent is to leave some of the variation in here. I don't want this to be too photographic smooth and then paint the background really thin and abstract. It does have to tie together to some degree, and so I'm actually thinking about that ahead of time, even before. How smooth can I get this, but still look like it's a painting, really, when you look at it up close. The reference photo on the left, I think, maybe flattened out some of the colors in the mouth, made them a little more obscure, at least a little more than what I'm able to identify on the model. Again, if you're working at home, painting what's there will certainly not affect the credibility of it. It's not going to be a bad painting because you painted it how it is in the photo. You just might not see quite as much color. We saw that with the last painting, the 3-session figure painting. There was some color dropping at the lower values, between the arm and the torso, where I was able to actually identify a little more when looking at the model. And this is another situation here where I'm able to see a little more color in the upper lip than we can in the photo. We have to remember that the corners of the mouth, again, that tilt between the corners of the mouth must match to some degree the tilt between the corners of the eyes. That helps put that whole head into perspective. So you notice I really waited until the eye was pretty much finished before I came back and even indicated that corner of the mouth on the right side. Because again, I'm working from a head that's continually shifting a little bit by little bit, and so the eyes were a little easier to anchor because the color is not as required. It's such a dark value. So I resolved the eyes a little bit more and then adjusted the tilts of the mouth to match my tilts of the eyes.
Could you just measure the tilt of the mouth off the tilt of the eyes on your painting?
Usually, yeah. I mean, that's what has to happen in a case like this. They might come together a little bit depending on how much the head is turned. So they will be at slightly different angles, but it'll still look believable for the most part if you put them at the same angle. It's interesting because this was something that I didn't do when I first started painting at the palette and chisel, because I didn't have any knowledge back then. I only painted what I saw. I was trying to be as faithful to what I saw as possible, and I was also a very slow and careful painter. And what I noticed when we were doing the 5 and 6 hour poses, that in the first 3 hours before lunch, I would be able to get the forehead, eyes, and at least some of the nose painted in. And then in the last 2 or 3 hours after lunch, I would have to do the rest of the nose and then the mouth and chin and whatever surrounding area was. And unfortunately, the tilt was always slightly different before lunch as after lunch. And so I was always just painting what I saw. So I ended up with a lot of paintings where the mouth tilts didn't line up to the eye tilts. Eventually, I think after probably 2 years or so of painting at the palette and chisel, I was fast enough to hit the whole portrait in 3 hours. And because I was still an observational painter after 2 years, I hadn't studied quite yet enough of the anatomy, and I didn't want to paint what I knew as opposed to what I saw. I just kept doing the same thing over and over again until I got faster. So then I was able to hit that head in 3 hours, at least if it was a smaller head, and my tilts and angles would be good because we wouldn't have that huge break where things shifted a little bit. And then it got to the point even where I started to recognize how bad some of my tilts and angles were in my earlier paintings, that I would tell myself, oh, if I can't get the head in the first 3 hours, I'm abandoning this, I'm going to try something different in the afternoon.
Oh, wow.
Now I would just adjust the tilt of the mouth.
Were open studios always that long at the palette and chisel?
It was different time lengths for different days of the week. I think Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday were longer open studios, 9 to 3, or sometimes 9 to 4 if we extended it, and then a half hour for lunch. It was 9 to 3:30 with a half hour for lunch. That sounds about right. And then a shorter one Thursday nights, and then Friday nights, and then Saturday, shorter one too.
Wow.
And then Sunday we did artist painting artists. So it was another, I think, 5 hour maybe.
Wow. And you said you'd go home and then work on a longer painting?
Well, no, I would go home and then go to work.
Oh.
And then I would I would go home and sleep for like 4 hours, 5 hours, and then go to work. Then I would get off of work, and then go to the palette and chisel and come back. It was just on days that I didn't go down to the palette and chisel that I would work on my longer paintings.
Oh, okay. That's not a lot of sleep.
Nope, not a lot. So we're pretty much done with the head here. And I might revisit it later on in the painting if I feel there's something that's really necessary.